What would you do if you used your last few dollars to pay for a stranger's meal, only to have a man in a $1,000 suit hand you a mysterious key the very next morning? For one struggling waitress, a simple act of genuine kindness unlocked a life-altering, terrifying secret. The wind howling off Casco Bay in Portland, Maine, felt like a physical blow against the large plate-glass windows of the Harborview Diner. It was a miserable Tuesday night in late November, the kind of night where the rain didn't just fall. It flew sideways in freezing, biting sheets. Inside the diner smelled of stale fryer grease, industrial bleach, and burnt decaf coffee. Emily Stanton stood behind the Formica counter, mindlessly wiping down the same spot she had cleaned 3 times already. At 26, Emily had the kind of deep bruised exhaustion under her eyes that only came from working double shifts 6 days a week. She was entirely alone in the world, burying herself in work to outrun the crushing mountain of debt left behind by her late father's hospital treatments. Every tip, every hourly wage, every crumpled dollar bill went straight to the collection agencies that called her phone incessantly. She was currently wearing shoes with soles worn dangerously thin, desperately trying to save up enough to keep the heat on in her cramped, drafty apartment. The bell above the diner door jingled weakly, barely cutting through the sound of the storm outside. Emily looked up as a blast of freezing air swept through the restaurant. Standing in the entryway was an elderly man. He looked as though he had been walking for hours. A faded threadbare wool coat hung loosely on his frail frame, and a battered tweed fedora was pulled low over his eyes. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his hat, pooling on the black and white checkered linoleum floor. He stood there shivering violently, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking entirely lost. From the kitchen pass-through, Greg, the night manager, let out a loud, irritated sigh. Greg was a tightly wound, perpetually angry man who treated the rundown diner like it was a 5-star Michelin restaurant. "Don't let him sit in a booth," Greg hissed, leaning over the counter so only Emily could hear. "He's going to track mud everywhere, order a single cup of hot water, and stay for 3 hours. Tell him to buy something or get back out in the rain. I'm not running a charity ward." Emily frowned, her heart aching, as she watched the old man cautiously shuffle toward a small table near the back corner, far away from the windows. "He's an old man in a storm, Greg. Have some compassion," she whispered back. "I'll handle him." She grabbed a menu and a fresh pot of hot coffee, walking over to the corner table. As she approached, the man looked up. His face was weathered, deeply lined with age and sorrow, but his eyes were a striking, piercing shade of pale blue. They looked entirely out of place on a man who appeared so broken. "Evening, sir," Emily said softly, her voice warm and inviting. She flipped a heavy ceramic mug upright and poured the steaming coffee. "Terrible night to be out walking. Let's get you warmed up." The old man wrapped his trembling, blue-veined hands around the hot mug, closing his eyes as the warmth seeped into his skin. "Thank you, my dear," he said. His voice was gravelly quiet and incredibly polite. "It is rather unforgiving out there." "Take your time," Emily said, sliding the laminated menu toward him. "I recommend the Yankee pot roast tonight. It's heavy hot and it'll stick to your ribs." He offered a small, hesitant smile. "That sounds wonderful. I will have the pot roast, and perhaps a slice of cherry pie if you have it." "Coming right up," Emily said. For the next 45 minutes, Emily kept a close eye on him. She brought him extra dinner rolls, refilled his coffee before he even had to ask, and made sure his food was piping hot. The man ate slowly, savoring every single bite with a strange kind of reverence, almost as if he were memorizing the taste of the food. Every time Emily walked by, he offered a polite nod of gratitude. But as the meal came to an end, the atmosphere shifted. Emily watched from the counter as the old man reached into the breast pocket of his coat. He patted it. Then his hand moved to his side pockets. A look of mild concern flashed across his face. He stood up slightly, digging into his trouser pockets, and slowly the concern morphed into sheer, unadulterated panic. His breath hitched, and he began frantically patting down every inch of his soaked coat, pulling out a crumpled handkerchief, a pair of reading glasses, but no wallet. Greg had noticed, too. He marched out from behind the counter, a smug, angry look on his face. "I knew it," Greg muttered as he strode past Emily. "I absolutely knew it." Emily hurried to follow him, arriving at the table, just as Greg slammed his hands down on the old man's table. "Is there a problem here, buddy?" Greg demanded, loudly drawing the attention of the two truck drivers sitting at the counter. The old man looked up, his pale blue eyes wide with humiliation. A deep flush of red crept up his wrinkled neck. I am so terribly sorry," he stammered, his voice breaking. "I seem to have misplaced my wallet. I know I had it when I left home. I must have dropped it in the street." "Yeah, sure you did," Greg sneered, leaning in close. "Dropped it in the street. That's a new one. Your bill is $24.50. You either pay it right now, or I'm calling the Portland police. We don't tolerate thieves." "Please," the old man whispered, shrinking back into the vinyl booth. "I am not a thief. If you just give me until tomorrow, I swear to you I will bring the money." "I'm calling the cops," Greg said, reaching for his phone. "Stop it, Greg." Emily's voice cracked like a whip through the diner. Both Greg and the old man stared at her in shock. Emily stepped between her manager and the booth, her jaw set in defiance. "You are making a scene over $24. Look at him, Greg. He made a mistake. He stole from the register, Emily. If he doesn't pay it, comes out of your drawer." Greg warned, his face turning purple. "Fine, let it," Emily snapped. She reached into her dark green apron. Her fingers brushed against the small wad of cash she had made in tips that night. It was $32. That money was supposed to buy her groceries for the rest of the week. It was her bus fare. It was her survival. She pulled out a 20 and a 5, slapping them down on the table. "There, the tab is covered. Now back off." Greg stared at the money, then glared at Emily. "You're an idiot, Stanton," he muttered, snatching the bills and storming back to the kitchen. Emily let out a shaky breath and turned back to the old man. He was staring at her, an unreadable expression on his face. The humiliation was gone, replaced by a deep, profound intensity. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. "You work too hard to throw your money away on a foolish old man." "It's just money," Emily lied, offering him a gentle smile. "Everyone deserves a hot meal, especially on a night like this. Don't worry about it." The old man stood up slowly, buttoning his damp wool coat. He looked at her name tag, then up into her eyes. "Emily, what is your last name, my dear?" "Stanton," she replied. "Emily Stanton." He repeated, testing the syllables on his tongue, as if committing them to memory. He reached out and gently patted her hand. His skin was freezing cold, but his touch was strangely comforting. "You have a rare heart, Emily Stanton. Do not let this cruel world harden it. Thank you." Without another word, he turned and walked out into the freezing storm, swallowed up by the darkness of the Maine night. Emily watched him go, a strange, hollow feeling settling in her chest. She had $24 less to her name, but as she cleared his table, she knew she wouldn't have done it any differently. Beneath his empty coffee mug, scribbled hastily on a paper napkin in blue ink, were 3 words: "You are seen." The next morning broke with blinding, bitter sunlight. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sharp, biting cold that made the pavement sparkle with frost. Emily was back at the Harbourview Diner by 6 a.m., opening up for the breakfast rush. Her feet throbbed, her head ached from lack of sleep, and her stomach rumbled loudly. She had skipped breakfast because she couldn't afford to buy anything from the diner's kitchen after giving up her tips the night before. By 9 a.m., the diner was packed. Emily was balancing 3 plates of eggs and hash browns on her arm when she noticed the atmosphere in the room suddenly change. The loud chatter of the truck drivers and local fishermen died down to a murmur. Emily glanced out the front window. Parked right along the crumbling curb, taking up 2 spaces, was a pristine, jet-black Lincoln Town car. It looked entirely alien against the backdrop of rusted pickup trucks and fishing gear. The diner door opened, and a man stepped inside. He was entirely out of place. He was in his late 50s, wearing a bespoke charcoal-grey pinstripe suit that likely cost more than Emily made in a year. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and carried himself with a stiff, intimidating posture. His eyes scanned the room with professional detachment until they landed on Greg, who was standing paralyzed behind the register. The man walked up to the counter. "I am looking for a Miss Emily Stanton," he said. His voice was crisp, authoritative, and carried a distinct Boston Brahmin accent. "I was informed she works at this establishment." Greg blinked, intimidated by the sheer wealth radiating from the man. He wordlessly pointed a finger toward the back booths where Emily was passing out plates. The man in the suit approached her just as she set the last plate of eggs down. "Ms. Stanton?" he inquired. Emily wiped her hands on her apron, her heart suddenly pounding in her throat. Her first thought was debt collectors. They had found her work. They were going to garnish her wages. "Yes, that's me. If this is about the medical bills I told the agency I need until Friday. I am not a debt collector, Ms. Stanton." The man interrupted, smoothly offering a polite but tight smile. "My name is Richard Alcott. I am an attorney with Alcott Vance and, excuse me, Alcott and Sterling. No, Alcott and Partners." He corrected himself quickly. "Is there a place we might speak privately?" Emily stared at him, bewildered. I'm on shift. I can't leave." "I've already compensated your manager for your time," Alcott said, gesturing toward Greg, who was eagerly counting a stack of crisp bills behind the counter. "Please, it will only take a moment. Sit down." Hesitantly, Emily slid into an empty booth. Alcott sat opposite her, placing his expensive briefcase on the sticky laminate table. He popped the latches and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "I represent the estate of the late Arthur Pendleton." Alcott began his tone, shifting into something solemn. "Arthur Pendleton." Emily repeated the name. It meant nothing to her. "Yes, an elderly gentleman. I believe you served him dinner here last evening. He was wearing a grey wool coat and a fedora." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "The old man from last night, he died." "I am afraid so," Alcott said quietly. "Mr. Pendleton suffered a massive cardiac arrest in his sleep at approximately 3 o'clock this morning. It was peaceful, I am told. He had a severe heart condition, which he was well aware of. In fact, he knew his time was extremely limited." "Oh my God," Emily whispered, putting a hand over her mouth. The memory of his cold hands, his piercing blue eyes, the way he savored the cherry pie, it all rushed back to her. "I just saw him. He didn't have his wallet. Arthur Pendleton was not a vagrant, Ms. Stanton," Alcott said gently. "He was the founder and majority shareholder of Pendleton Shipping. He was worth roughly $400 million. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. She stared at the lawyer, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the hidden cameras to pop out. "I don't understand." Arthur was a deeply eccentric man, especially after his wife passed away. Alcott explained his professional veneer cracking just slightly to reveal genuine fondness. When he was diagnosed with terminal heart failure last month, he began wandering the city. He wore old clothes. He wanted to see the world as it was without the shield of his wealth. He wanted to see how people treated a man who had nothing to offer them. Alcott slid the heavy manila envelope across the table toward Emily. Last night, after he left this diner, he called me at my private residence. He woke me up at midnight to dictate an immediate addendum to his last will and testament. He was very specific. He wanted to ensure that the woman who spent her last $20 to feed a penniless old man was repaid for her kindness. Emily's hands shook as she picked up the envelope. It was heavy. She broke the seal and tipped it upside down. A large, ornate silver key fell onto the table with a heavy metallic clatter. It looked antique, intricate, and heavily polished. Alongside the key was a single sheet of heavy stationery paper with Arthur's handwriting. Emily, kindness is the only true currency we take with us when we go. You gave me your last $1, expecting nothing but to shield an old man from humiliation. My lawyer has given you a key. It belongs to the property at 412 Crestview Drive in Cape Elizabeth. Go there today. Do not wait. Arthur P. Emily stared at the note, her vision blurring with tears. Crestview Drive in Cape Elizabeth, she whispered. That was the most exclusive, hyper-wealthy coastal neighborhood in the state. The property is legally yours, Miss Stanton, Alcott said, snapping his briefcase shut and standing up. The deed and the transfer taxes have already been finalized and paid in full. I advise you to visit the estate immediately. Before Emily could ask another question, Alcott nodded respectfully and walked out of the diner, leaving her sitting alone with a silver key and a head full of impossible questions. 3 hours later, Emily's shift ended. She didn't go back to her apartment. Instead, she took 3 different buses, traveling out of the gritty city center and onto the winding oceanside roads of Cape Elizabeth. The salt air smelled sharp and clean here. The houses she passed were massive, sprawling estates, hidden behind tall iron gates. Finally, the bus dropped her off near the end of a private road. Emily walked for half a mile, the silver key burning a hole in her coat pocket. She arrived at 412 Crestview Drive. It wasn't just a house. It was a massive 3-story Victorian mansion built from grey stone, perched on a cliff overlooking the crashing waves of the Atlantic Ocean. A wrought-iron gate stood at the end of the driveway, slightly ajar. Emily walked up the long cobblestone driveway, her heart hammering against her ribs. The house looked quiet, still, and impossibly grand. She climbed the wide stone steps to the heavy oak front door. Her hand trembled violently as she pulled the silver key from her pocket. She slid it into the brass lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. Emily turned the brass knob and pushed the heavy door open, stepping into the grand foyer. What she saw inside made her drop her purse to the marble floor in absolute shock. The heavy oak door swung shut behind Emily with a resonant thud, sealing her inside the cavernous silence of the mansion. Her cheap, worn canvas purse lay discarded on the gleaming black-and-white checkered marble floor. She wasn't staring at the sweeping mahogany staircase, nor the glittering crystal chandelier that hung suspended like frozen rain from the vaulted ceiling. Her eyes were locked onto a massive gold-framed oil painting hanging in the center of the foyer. It was a portrait of a young woman standing on a wind-swept cliff, her dark hair blowing across her face. She wore a simple white dress, and her pale blue eyes were fixed fiercely on the painter. Those eyes. They were the exact same piercing, sorrowful blue as the old man's in the diner. But that wasn't what had stolen the breath from Emily's lungs. The woman in the painting looked exactly like Emily. Emily stumbled backward, her hand flying to her chest. Beneath the portrait was a small brass plaque. She crept closer, her footsteps echoing sharply off the marble. The engraving read, Catherine Pendleton, 1970 to 1999. "Mom." Emily choked out the word, feeling strange and foreign on her tongue. Her mother had died of leukemia when Emily was barely 3 years old. Her father, a hard-working but perpetually broke mechanic, had never spoken much about her, only saying that Catherine's family had disapproved of him and cut ties entirely. He had raised Emily alone, eventually succumbing to his own brutal battle with cancer, leaving Emily drowning in the debt he had accumulated, trying to stay alive. Trembling, Emily turned away from the painting and wandered deeper into the house. The mansion was pristine, but felt entirely hollow, like a museum waiting for an exhibit. She moved through a massive, formal dining room, a kitchen adorned with dark granite, and finally pushed open a set of heavy double doors leading into a wood-paneled study. The room smelled of old paper leather and pipe tobacco. In the center sat a massive antique desk. On the green leather blotter in the middle of the desk lay a single thick envelope. Across the front, written in the same shaky blue ink as the napkin from the diner, was her name, Emily. She sank into the high-backed leather chair, her fingers clumsily tearing open the seal. Inside was a multi-page letter, dated just 3 days prior. My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, my treacherous heart has finally given out, and Richard has followed my instructions. I imagine you are terribly confused. By now you have seen the portrait of my daughter Catherine, your mother. I am not just an old man who forgot his wallet in a storm, Emily. I am your grandfather. Emily gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth, as a fresh wave of tears blurred the ink on the page. 30 years ago, I made the greatest mistake of my life. I was a proud, arrogant man who valued my shipping empire above all else. When Catherine fell in love with your father, a man I deemed beneath our station, I demanded she leave him. When she refused, I cut her off entirely. I let my pride build a wall between us. It was a wall I was too stubborn to tear down, even when I learned she had passed away. I convinced myself your father was unfit, but my own cowardice kept me from reaching out to you. When my doctors told me I had only weeks to live, the ghosts of my past became unbearable. I hired private investigators to find you. I learned about your father's passing. I learned about the crushing debts you were saddled with. I watched from afar as you worked yourself to the bone day in and day out in that diner. But I had to know. I had to know if the Pendleton curse of greed was in your blood, or if your father had raised you to be better than I ever was. So I staged my visit to the Harborview diner. I purposely left my wallet in my town car. I wanted to see what you would do when confronted with a helpless, useless old man who had nothing to offer you. You gave me your last dollar, Emily. You defended me. You showed me a grace and humanity I did not deserve. With this letter, Richard Alcott holds the legal documents to my entire estate. The house, the trust funds, the majority share in Pendleton. Shipping it is all yours. Forgive a foolish old man for his pride. Live a beautiful life, my brave granddaughter. You are no longer alone. With all my love, Arthur. Emily lowered the letter, her chest heaving as she sobbed into the quiet room. The crushing weight of her reality, the debt, the fear, the endless exhaustion began to crack and fracture. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a Pendleton. What in the hell are you doing in my uncle's chair? The sharp, angry voice shattered the heavy silence of the study. Emily jumped, wiping her eyes as she looked up. Standing in the doorway was a man in his early 40s wearing a tailored navy suit and an expression of pure, unadulterated rage. He had Arthur's nose, but none of his quiet dignity. Behind him stood two burly men who looked like private security. "Who are you?" Emily asked, standing up slowly, instinctively slipping Arthur's letter into her coat pocket. "I am Harrison Croft," the man spat, stepping fully into the room. "I am Arthur Pendleton's nephew and the Vice President of Pendleton Shipping, and you are trespassing. The security alarm alerted me the moment the front gate opened. I don't know how a diner waitress got past the locks, but you have exactly 10 seconds to get out before I have my men drag you out by your hair." Emily's heart hammered, but as she looked at Harrison, she didn't feel the familiar panic that usually gripped her when Greg yelled at her. She felt a sudden, surprising surge of power. She was standing in her house. "I suggest you watch your tone, Mr. Croft." A calm, authoritative voice echoed from the hallway. Richard Alcott strode into the study, his leather briefcase in hand. He did not look amused. "Take your security detail outside Harrison, immediately." Harrison whirled around his face, flushing red. "Richard, thank God. This vagrant broke into Arthur's home. Have her arrested. And where are the keys to the safe? I need to secure the company ledgers before probate begins." "There will be no probate for you to manage, Harrison," Alcott said smoothly, stepping past him to stand beside Emily. He unlocked his briefcase and pulled out a thick, bound legal document. "Arthur executed a new ironclad will last night. You are not the executor of this estate. Nor are you the primary beneficiary." Harrison froze, the color draining from his face. What are you talking about? I am his only living relative." "You are his nephew," Alcott corrected coldly. "Allow me to introduce you to Miss Emily Stanton, or rather, Emily Pendleton, Arthur's biological granddaughter, and the sole heir to the Pendleton estate, including the entirety of his 68% controlling stake in Pendleton Shipping." The silence in the room was absolute. Harrison stared at Emily, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and revulsion. "The waitress. That's impossible. Catherine's brat died years ago. Arthur told me himself." "Arthur told you what he wanted you to believe, knowing your penchant for corporate sabotage," Alcott replied. "As of 8 o'clock this morning, Ms. Stanton is your employer, Harrison. I suggest you reconsider threatening to have her dragged out by her hair." Harrison's jaw worked soundlessly. He looked from the fiercely calm lawyer to the young woman standing tall behind the mahogany desk. Realizing he had entirely lost the war before he even knew it had begun, Harrison spun on his heel and stormed out of the house, his security men trailing awkwardly behind him. Once the front door slammed shut, Alcott turned to Emily, offering a rare, genuine smile. "He will undoubtedly try to contest it, but Arthur and I made sure the documents are bulletproof. The estate is yours, Emily. Your father's medical debts have already been paid in full via a wire transfer I authorized an hour ago. You are free." Emily gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, letting the reality wash over her. The bone-deep exhaustion that had plagued her for years seemed to evaporate into the warm, quiet air of the study. 2 days later, the rain returned to Portland, washing the grit from the city streets. Inside the Harborview diner, Greg was screaming at a new dishwasher when the front door chimed. He whipped around his face, turning an ugly shade of purple as he saw Emily standing in the entryway. She wasn't wearing her stained green apron. She wore a tailored wool trench coat and carried a sleek designer handbag. "Stanton!" Greg barked, marching toward her. "You no call, no showed for 2 days. You're fired. Get out of my diner." "It's not your diner anymore, Greg," Emily said calmly. Greg stopped in his tracks. "Excuse me." Emily reached into her handbag and pulled out a manila folder, dropping it onto the nearest table. "I bought the building and the business this morning. The ink is still wet, I'm transferring ownership to Maria and Dave, she said, gesturing to the two stunned line cooks watching from the kitchen window. Greg's mouth fell open, a pathetic squeak escaping his throat. And Greg. Emily smiled, feeling the ghost of her grandfather standing proudly beside her. You're fired. Get out of my diner. As Greg sputtered and stumbled out into the pouring rain, Emily walked over to the corner booth where Arthur had sat just nights ago. She placed her hand on the vinyl seat, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace. She had spent her last $20 to buy a stranger a meal, and in return, he had bought her the world. Emily's journey from a struggling waitress to the sole heir of a shipping empire proves that you never know how a single act of compassion can alter your destiny. If this story gave you chills, make sure to hit that like button, share it with a friend, and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below, telling us about a time you helped a stranger. Let's spread the kindness.